always, am I speaking loud enough? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. And if I should sort of go down with my voice, just tell me. I would like to start with, I mean, you have mentioned the Austrians as the privileged nations. For the Austrian, it's always a somewhat confusing identity, because when talking about the Austrians, this can mean the Austrians and Hungarians altogether. It can mean the Austrian half of the monarchy. It can mean the German Austrians. And sometimes people are not always clear what we are talking about. So, and this is also, I think, to some extent important when it comes to memorizing the First World War. But I would also like to say that for the Austrians in memory, the First World War started on the 28th of June. The first victims were Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. And of course, from the Austrian side, it was always seen as a just war, as a defensive war. I mean, that was very clear, the main theme. What is also important that the memory of this war was, and to some extent still is, physically with us. And I'm coming back to what Zoltán said about the war memorials in Hungary. Like in Hungary, there is at least one memorial in every town. This is something which started already in 1915, and which is interesting. The idea to have war memorials in towns came from Serbia, because this was not something which has happened before. There were a few exceptions referring to the Bosnian campaign of 1878, but that was the exception rather than the rule. For earlier wars, you had memorials on the battlefields, monuments to regiments, to individuals. When you go to Königgrätz, Radić Kralove, you still find numerous monuments there. There were interesting memorials, monuments put up at locations of the Napoleonic Wars just before the First World War, 1805 at Dürnstein and Austerlitz. And these, interestingly, were not nationalistic monuments, but sort of common monuments, remembering the Austrians and the Russians and the French who had died there. So very much in what we might nowadays call a European spirit. And when the Austrians entered Serbia in 1914, they found that in almost every Serbian town there was a monument to the victims of the Balkan Wars, to the heroes of the Balkan Wars, and the Austrians said this is a good idea, we should copy it. And so already starting in 1915, several monuments were put up. There were different designs. I'm not going into details, but it means that there's a sort of continuation. What is interesting that for the Second World War, in most of these cases, additional plaques were put up. There are almost no monuments for the Second World War, but additional plaques with the victims of the Second World War were put to the monuments of the First World War. And when we did a study some 20 years ago or so about war monuments in Austria, what is interesting, the idea was to have the heroes, the fallen heroes of the war, still living in the community. So the war monument would be on the main square. And what is interesting, about 1/3 of the monuments are still standing where they were. 1/3 was destroyed, fell victim to new streets or whatever, and 1/3 was moved from the main place to the cemetery. So more or less from the living to the dead, putting them aside to where the dead belong. But there is, of course, in Austria, probably more so than in Hungary and more so than in the other successor countries, a certain continuity here. When it comes to historiography and dealing with the First World War, in the 1920s, 1930s, you had lots of memoirs published, mainly by officers participating in the war. It's also called the officers' historiography, Offiziersgeschichtsschreibung. Sometimes critically about others, very rarely critically about themselves, I mean, a very common feature, not unknown in later years. In 1930, the war archives, the Kriegsarchiv started to publish the official history of the First World War, done in cooperation with Hungarians, with Germans. It was called Österreich-Ungarns letzter Krieg, Austria-Hungary's last war, consisting of no less than 7 volumes plus 7 map volumes. So the whole thing is quite big. And the last volume was published in 1938. So there exists one official history of the First World War. There certainly was, the First World War was part of the common experience in the 1920s, 1930s. Lots of books were written, lots of films were made, the film becoming, of course, the new media. There was also, when it comes to books and literature, a strong German influence. So the Western Front was very much present there, although the Austrian participation on the Western Front was rather limited. What is interesting also that different theaters of war were commemorialized very differently. So the one place which really captured the imagination of the people were the Alps, the war in the mountains. This is where the last heroes were. You had the mountain guides like Sepp Innerkofler, you even had heroines like Victoria Safs. So militarily speaking, the war in the Alps was almost unimportant. But this was the glorious part. And of course it was also linked to the question of South Tyrol, the southern part of Tyrol, which became Italian after the First World War, which was well after the Second World War, a bit of a touchy issue. I mean, we might have lost Bosnia, we might have lost Galicia, which was bad enough, but having lost South Tyrol, that was really bad. The other fronts of the First World War, yes, Galicia was a bloody business, so was the Sorso Valley. But otherwise, this was not really so much prominent, even though, of course, many more people died on the Sorso front or in Galicia than in the Alps, in the Dolomite Mountains. There were a few exceptions, the Carpathian Winter War, that's something which was present, but the other fronts, the Serbian front, southeastern Europe, never worried about Palestine. I mean, this was not prominent in the common imagination or in the common knowledge. Something which also, of course, was sort of item of memory which was commonly known, that was the prisoners of war, mainly the Austrian prisoners of war in Siberia. Nobody thought about Serb or Russian prisoners of war in Austria, that's a different story. But the fate of the Austrian prisoners of war, some of whom returned in 1921, 1922, if they returned at all, that was something which was also part of the common memory. To some extent, even though the Republic of German Austria, later Austria, dissociated itself from the old monarchy, which went as far that from the Austrian point of view, the peace treaty of Saint-Germain is called the State Treaty, establishing a new state and not making peace on behalf of something of the past. Nonetheless, the memory of the First World War was officially taken over in the Austrian armed forces in 1924, and it was even reinforced in the 1930s. So a lot of units, a lot of regiments had a special regimental commemoration day referring to some battle of the First World War, which of course was still very much prominent in common memory at the time. A lot of soldiers of these units might actually have fought there, so this was something very present. And this is actually something which was revived in the Second Republic. In the 1960s, the tradition for the Austrian army was re-regulated, and of course the Second World War was not part of the official memory. This was somebody else's war. The Germans fought it against the Allies, but the Austrians won. So the old tradition of the First Republic was taken over, and so Austrian units are still celebrating commemorative days from the First World War, taking place at places which nobody knows about nowadays. So you have, I don't know, the Reconnaissance Battalion 3 at Mittelbach. They would, of course, commemorate the Battle of Jaroslavice in August 1914. Few people would know where Jaroslavice is. And for the aviation troops, the commemoration is still the air battle over Montello in 1918. So this is something where the First World War is still prominent. After the Second World War, of course, the Second World War overshadowed everything. For Austria, it also meant a new identity. Before the Second World War, before the Anschluss, the Austrian identity was clearly a German one. This was no longer valid after 1945. Austria was liberated, or found itself suddenly liberated, and so a new Austrian identity was needed. It could not be German anymore, so what's better than going back to the good old times? And so suddenly the old monarchy was glorified, became part of a nostalgic memory. It was so nice in the good old days, mainly before the First World War, not exactly during the First World War. And this is something of it's part of the new identity. You had these lovely films made about Sissi and everything else, which is part of the new Austrian identity. I already mentioned that when it comes to the monument, the Second World War was added by plaques, but the basic monument was still the one for the First World War. But very few publications were issued about the First World War, a few memoirs occasionally. Again, the only exceptions was the war in the Alps. When you come to the Tyrol or when you come to northern Italy, you have numerous books published both by Austrians and Italians about the heroic war in the Alps. And in addition to this, you only had this a bit of a niche interest, I would call it, aviation and naval historians. I mean, but that's a sort of a minute group. They would be interested in the First World War as well. There were a few scholarly works published about the First World War, and we had the first people interested in what was then called contemporary history, Ludwig Jetitschke and Franz Gall and others. They would commission dissertations, theses about the First World War, and some of those are actually still valid, were very well written. For example, the one by Rudolf Hecht about the mobilization during the First World War, which is an excellent book and which was never published as a book, but it was published by our academy a few years ago. Anybody who would like to have a copy, just give me your coordinates, because we still have a few copies left. There were a lot of other dissertations, mainly about operational history, military history in the traditional sense. Gerd Adler wrote about the South Tyrol offensive, Rudi Jaschabek about the Brusilov offensive, and a lot of interesting studies were done, mainly in cooperation between the university and the war archives. But these were not so much, but few of these books actually made it onto the market. There were only in the 1980s a few biographies written on Benfield, on Podjorek, a very good book by Rudi Jaschabek and others. What is also important to note that Peter Bruček, one of the leading historians at the War Archives, was phenomenal in collecting memoirs, personal documents. When he took over the collection of personal documents, he had something like 200 pieces. By now it's more than 2,000. And he himself edited 3 major of these memoirs by Glees Horstenau, Zeinek, and by Janser, which are very important sources for the First World War. Also in the late 1980s, Manfred Rauchensteiner, who later became director of the Military Museum in Vienna, became interested in the First World War. Until then, he had worked mainly on the end of the Second World War and post-World War II history. And he commissioned also a lot of dissertations. He wrote a big book which was published in 1992 about Austria-Hungary and the First World War, and this was then republished about a year ago with some additions. Apparently for the last 10 or 15 years there was also a renewed interest by young historians, by students. Again, a number of dissertations was published, but this time not so much about operational history, about military history in the traditional sense, but more about social issues, about questions like prisoners of war, internment camps, the civil population, civil-military relations, women in the military, and the like. There was one important study by Richard Lein about the alleged desertions by Czech soldiers during the First World War, and a number of others. And some of these younger historians also became very engaged in the events this year, in numerous conferences. There's one just taking place today in Vienna, looking back on the research brought about by this year of commemoration. I would say we were all surprised by how many books were published. From autumn 2013 onwards, there was apparently great interest. Rauchensteiner's second enlarged edition of his book has apparently sold more than 10,000 copies, which for Austria, for a scholarly work, is sensational. Normally we are talking about 2,000 or 3,000 copies if we are lucky. By the way, what's also interesting, the book by Alma Hannig about Franz Ferdinand, one of 4 biographies published last year, has also sold more than 5,000 copies, and she has told me that it just came out in Hungarian as well. So you should find it in the bookshops here as well. There was a lot of discussion mainly about Christopher Clark's book, which was of course very influential and which sort of took everybody by surprise, because until 2012, 2013 everybody thought, well, 2014 will be the bad guys again. Germany and Austria started the war. Okay. We'll have to somehow live through it, and now Christopher Clark is here. And of course Christopher Clark's book has to some extent been instrumentalized also in a way which he never intended. And I personally think it's a great book, but that's a personal opinion. There was a lot of discussion, there was a bit of discussion of course whether this was actually the end of the Fischer thesis. Now the Fischer thesis was always gladly jumped upon by rather left-wing historians, and was never taken serious by other historians who said, well, Fischer was more a philosopher than a historian in the first place. So there was a bit of discussion about that. What is interesting that a lot of discussion centered about the outbreak of the war, Sarajevo and after, but not so much about the war itself. Rauchensteiner was involved in this. What is quite funny that in the first edition of his book he sort of paints the story that the foreign minister Berthold and of course the chief of staff Konrads were the bad guys pushing Francis Joseph into the war by inventing a battle which never took place, and in the second edition suddenly the emperor is the bad guy. This was a little bit funny for the discussions between the historians. There were a lot of TV documentaries shown, also Austrian ones. What is interesting, there was, to my knowledge, only one film, which was again about the war in the Alps, which was just very briefly shown. And there was one TV movie made to commemorate the Sarajevo murders, and this was loosely based on a novel by Milo Dor, and tells a fascinating, totally stupid story of a conspiracy that the German investors wanted finally to have a railway going from Berlin to Baghdad, and there was only the one piece missing going through Serbia, so they had to provoke a war against Serbia, and they financed Princip to eventually kill Franz Ferdinand. And the only thing which is worse than the plot was actually that the movie was filmed in Hradec Králové, in the north of the Czech Republic, so you can imagine how much Sarajevo atmosphere there was in the movie. There were a lot of discussions of the what-if type. What if Franz Ferdinand had survived? What if, would the monarchy have continued or not? Would it have been fallen apart or not? But again, it's much more about Austria-Hungary and its viability as a state in 1914 than about the war itself. And so we are now waiting how the discussion will continue. There were numerous conferences held during this year. At our academy we started already 2 years ago, and we now have plans for conferences until 2021, which will be on a bilateral basis. This year we had it with Serbia on 1914. Next year it will be with Turkey, and it will end, if it continues in the way it is planned, in 2021 together with Hungary, dealing with the battles after the First World War and the Burgenland. And with this, I think it was a short overview, and of course you're more than welcome to ask any questions. Thank you very much.